Alright, so here's a question for you. What do you think of when you think of an engine? Screaming exhaust notes, chrome all over the dang place, and side exit exhausts, performance, and personality? I think it's a safe bet to say that by far the most recognizable engine layout, probably in history, has been the V8. First being introduced in 1904 in the form of the French Antoinette engine, and later being adapted for mass production in cars such as the 1914 Cadillac Type 51 with its L-head V8. Since its inception, the V8 layout has become a staple of performance and smoothness, while at the same time being attainable worldwide throughout the years. It can't really be understated just how important the V8 has been to the history of the automobile as a whole. Notable examples like the 32 Ford Flathead proved to be a great and affordable platform for people who were looking for excitement, being especially popular with soldiers headed home from the Second World War who came home looking for another sense of brotherhood and a rush of adrenaline along with it, effectively kick-starting the iconic hot rod movement and culture that still lives on well into the modern day. Although the V8 layout is as loved as it is, and although the Ford Flathead motor was such an important benchmark in the history of the V8, that doesn't really mean that there weren't any failures. And on that note, I think it's a good idea to discuss how much of a failure the early Flatheads were, but also some other examples of the worst V8 engines to ever be used in cars. Ever. Forever.
It is what it is. Get off my fucking back!
Alright, first up on the list, and let me just restate. The Flathead was really important, and it was really alright for its time, alright? This was literally the first time that you could look like a Victorian chimney-sweeping child and buy a car that had a V8, which was pretty much because Ford found the cheapest way to produce engines. Essentially, they just put all the valves and stuff inside of the block instead of the heads. So what you got was a 65 horsepower engine, which, yes, it's low, but at least if you were coming back from the worst war in human history, you could get one for a pretty good deal. The thing is, these motors were so scared and sad that they basically crapped their pants if you decided to go somewhere where the weather was approaching lukewarm. And what I mean by this is that the motors would vapor lock, which means that the fuel from the tank would boil in the lines and vaporize before getting to the cylinders, which isn't good, because the vapors get in the way of the fuel actually making it to the engine. The radiator and the coolant were also basically for decoration, because they would just boil over from heat as well. All these temp issues were mostly because of how badly designed these motors were, since they had terrible airflow due to the way that their intake and exhausts are. Beside this, obviously, it's a really old car, so by this point Ford hadn't really figured out the best way of making a fuel pump, or for that matter, a water pump. And also, I mean, these cars weren't really super efficient because they were really primitive. And so on the topic of efficiency,
Look here! Look, listen!
So, basically, the way you make a car's engine efficient is to create a smooth path for lots of air to go in and for exhaust to go out, and then tune the fuel delivery and ignition accordingly. Ford Flathead's intake and exhaust valves being right next to the cylinder, because they put all the valves and the linkages in the cylinder, meant that after entering the air intake, the air would have to go around two 90-degree turns to get to the cylinder, just to turn around for two more 90-degree turns trying to get out. Also, since the valves were right next to each other on the power stroke, the burn stuff that should be going out the exhaust valve gets pushed back into the intake valve. Basically just wasted horsepower. Also, there's only 6 exhaust exits for 8 cylinders, because cheap. Basically, the air is stuck inside of the engine, and that makes it heat up quick, and too much heat is bad. And so, on the topic of bad, how about the Cadillac Northstar V8? So originally, the Northstar was released in mid-1992 as an attempt to create a more performance-oriented engine to be used in higher-end models. Although they were debuted in Cadillacs, the engines were actually designed by Oldsmobile's R&D department. Eventually, in '96, the Northstar would end up becoming the standard engine for Cadillac models, excluding the Fleetwood, and would be phased out by 2011. Although honestly, the Northstar had some benefits and showed some promise, its issue was material quality. For some unknown reason, every Northstar engine from 95 to 05 used torque-to-yield bolts, which basically stretched when you tightened them. You see, the issue here is that they just didn't stop stretching. The head bolts didn't stop stretching. This isn't good because the heads separate enough to compromise the head gasket. So, goodbye engine. Who thought this was a good idea? Beside that, A good amount of Northstar engines also had water-cooled alternators as an attempt to make the alternators last longer. And this doesn't really suck, but the engineers eventually just realized that this was dumb, and so they got rid of it because they had a tendency to leak. You know, it's another weak point in a really big, weak system. So overall, there are some genuinely cool Northstar motors, like the ones that came in the XLR and STS-V models, but it took them 10 whole years just to realize that maybe using normal head bolts that don't stretch was the superior idea. These cars also came wrapped in lots of electrical nonsense, and to top it all off, they have a reputation for camshaft issues and oil burning. Oh yeah, on the topic of electrical nonsense,
Hi.
to give another point to Cadillac and maybe GM as a whole, let me tell you about the Cadillac 864 L62 motor. The 864 was the motor that replaced Cadillac's older L61, which was an earlier attempt to adhere to new at the time corporate average fuel economy requirements, CAFE for short. The L61 had to be replaced because it kind of failed at its job of trying to improve fuel economy, and so when the 864 came out, it got its name from a system.
It's a very good system.
Developed from a partnership between Cadillac and Eaton, you know, the people who make good superchargers, which essentially deactivated cylinders via solenoids on the rocker arms, preventing the rockers from opening the valves. It would be known as modulated displacement. Although in modern day GM have made it work pretty effectively, back then it was terrible because older computers weren't really keeping up with whatever the driver was doing, which meant that the engine would jerk and stall under basically any load. These engines also had problems with pinging, since the engineer's choice of EGR system effectively starved the engine for back pressure while under load with deactivated cylinders. It was only a matter of time, before the drivers got fed up with their misbehaving cars, and so customers were taking their Cadillacs off to the dealers to have the modulated displacement systems either completely disabled or have the dealers install a manual override which allowed the driver to choose whether or not their car was allowed to troll them that day. But, I guess that's enough of these older examples. Let me give you a more modern one before I give you the worst one. And so, moving on to that more modern one, we now discuss the BMW N63 V8. For its time, the N63 was pretty special because this was the first time that BMW had tried to mount a turbocharger to a V8, and not one, but two. And also, because German engineering, they created an entirely new engine layout for turbo V8s, and they called it the Hot V. Basically, instead of having a set of turbochargers in front or next to the engine, both turbos would be routed to sit right on top of the engine, and the intake manifolds are moved away to accommodate. Herein lies our issue. They decided to mount a really, really hot component right on top of the engine, really close to the head, so the heads and everything in them and near them gets unnecessarily hot, meaning that they constantly burned oil from factory and then blew up due to lack of lubrication and stress on the heads and the head gaskets. The heat also meant that buyers experienced problems with batteries going bad because of issues like electrolyte evaporation and overcharging. BMW would go on to recommend that dealer mechanics start filling cars' oil up past the recommended oil level, which, you're not supposed to do, and this was only to try and stave off problems, but it did little to nothing. Eventually, BMW got hit with a lawsuit where a guy accused them of knowingly neglecting to fix the N63's issues in an effort to run customers' warranties out so that they didn't have to cover the damages. So from 2012 on, BMW would update the N63 motors 3 different times, and they'd be forced to offer reimbursement packages to customers to try and stop the future damages. The first 2 updates in 2012 and 2016 would add a new turbocharger system, the Valvetronic system which BMW originally left out, new internals, a new fuel system, a second water pump, 200 more RPM in the power band, a relocated oil to coolant heat exchanger, and a removed blow-off valve. The final update in 2018 would bring bigger turbochargers, bigger fuel injectors, a new intake manifold, a new radiator, a better ignition system, and better thermal shielding to relieve heat just a little more. Within the same years as the updates, BMW would get even more lawsuits. They put out a voluntary recall for N63 cars in North America, but even now, they're still using this engine, which means obviously they must have ironed out all the immediate fatal issues. There's nothing else to say other than this seems pretty accurate given the stereotypes about how delicate German cars can be. It really is a shame too, because I bet the cars with the N63s probably drove really great for the first 12 or so miles that they ran well before they went kaboom.
Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
And now, onto an engine that probably never ran well ever, arguably the worst V8 ever, and widely considered to be one of the worst engines ever, the Triumph V8. Debuting in 1970, the Triumph V8 was a 3-liter, 145 horsepower, 170 pound-foot of torque water-cooled failure that was created as a replacement for a concept V8 that Triumph had created by twinning an existing inline-4 that they had, essentially just taking two inline-4 blocks and cutting them and joining them at the bottom to create a V8 because they were inspired by Pontiac. They thought to use a mechanical fuel injection system from Bosch, which probably would have been great, but they got frustrated trying to tweak the fuel injection system to meet US emissions laws, and so the engineers threw a tantrum and just came up with a carbureted design last minute. It's really painfully obvious too that they threw this thing together last minute because of just how badly they designed it. For starters, although the original engine was 2.5 liters, the engineers noticed that it was weaker than the concept engine. So instead of messing around with stroke or fuel delivery or the intake or something of actual worth, the engineers just made the cylinders wider, which killed any hope of having decent acceleration because it killed the torque that the concept engine would have otherwise had. To add insult to injury, the lack of thinking ahead meant that the coolant passages in the block had to be thinner to avoid weakening the block when increasing the cylinder size. And so, after drooling over the engine schematics and picking their noses for an hour, the engineers also decided that instead of a traditional water pump mounted on the front of the engine, like in every other car ever, that they would relocate the water pump to sit on the V of the engine and run it through an internal linkage and jack shaft. This gives you two problems. Number one being that the gears on the water pump shaft would shear off really suddenly, meaning that it would stop spinning and circulating water, and number two being that because the water pump was higher up than the fill cap for the radiator, it meant that you couldn't properly fill the Stag, which is the car that came in, with coolant while on flat ground, because it wouldn't fill enough to reach the water pump, so it wouldn't end up circulating like it should. Generally, these cars had plenty of issues with cooling and temperatures, as you can tell, but it didn't stop there, because since the engine blocks were iron and the heads were aluminum, which was pretty common at the time, Stag owners would have to use anti-corrosive coolant, but Triumph wouldn't get this info out very well, and so dealers and owners would fill the engines with the wrong coolant, which leads to oxidation. Beside this, and to save money, they only put a temperature sensor on one of the cylinder heads, which meant that the other head could overheat and you really would never know until it was far too late. And to top it all off, the Triumph V8 used a weird design for both the head studs and the timing chain. So, for the head studs, the problems were that the head studs weren't all parallel to each other, which meant that although you could swap the head gaskets without having to mess with the camshafts and set the valves, you now had the problem of weird warpage due to the different stud lengths and orientations, as well as the issue of longer studs getting stuck to the heads because of the different metals issue from before. For the timing chain, the issue was that the chains were too long and they were prone to stretching, coupled with the fact that these engines were the interference type, meant that when the engines lost their timing, the pistons and valves would slam into each other and destroy each other. Did I mention that these engines also had main bearings that would die often because they were too small to do their job properly? So, in the case of these motors, there really, truly isn't a better example for car ruined by engine. Around the world, cars like the Pontiac Fiero and the Subaru BRZ have been mocked for their underpowered and weak engines, but at least it can be said that their handling was considered good enough to outweigh the lack of performance. For the Triumph Stag, which is the car that carried the Triumph V8, the constant issues and service problems and critical failures took away any chance for people to actually take a chance on loving the car. And it really sucks because the looks and the handling were really well received by people when they came out. It's not like Triumph didn't have any other choice for a V8 to put in the Stag, obviously because they could have just found a way to sort out the emission issues that the concept had, but also because they could have just used a V8 from a Rover, which at the time was also owned by British Leyland, who was Triumph's parent company. The Stag's failure as a result of its engine would end up as a pretty big landmark event in the chain that would eventually lead to the Triumph name being retired in 1984. Now, there are plenty of pretty mediocre or just straight up bad V8 examples, but I'll keep it short for you. Hopefully this big dialogue about bad V8s serves as a pretty good reminder that a car's engine really isn't everything. even if it's a V8, and also that every company has probably had to make a big fat pile before they could come up with something worth being important. If you watched till now, thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and I'll see you around.